Recently, the Saab Jas-39 Gripen moved from beloved underdog to being put forward as a prime candidate, not just for Ukraine, but to serving as an inspiration of how NATO countries can use fighter jets in a dispersed posture with decentralized logistics, support and maintenance. Gripen gives the Swedish Air Force and other countries a low-cost, lightweight fighter platform that is very capable. But the question remains whether Gripen or the Swedish Air Force model of operations can be integrated, adapted or absorbed among NATO countries. In this video, I want to talk to you about Gripen, why its use in a force is more than just about a platform, and what the secret ingredients are for the Swedes, and why this may not work for everyone. Joining me too is Professor Justin Bronk from the Royal United Services Institute and Dr. Sophie Antrobus from the Freeman Air and Space Institute to give you an all-round appreciation of Sweden's Air Force model and the limitations for NATO. I'd also be very interested to hear your thoughts on this. Let me know in the comments how suited you believe Gripen and the Swedish model is to NATO partners, and if we should adapt a similar way of handling things. This video is sponsored by Patreon and channel membership supporters. The support provided by you, my patrons and channel members, allows me to focus on producing content without relying on YouTube's recommendation algorithm, and it directly funds various projects like the Inside the Cockpit series and archive and research trips. As patrons and channel members, you receive early access to videos, have access to our Discord server, and you receive a free sign-up gift. Right now there are also a number of interviews with experts that are in early access, so you can watch those immediately on signing up. Have a look at the various support options in more detail in the description below, and now let's talk about Gripen and the Swedish Air Force model. With Gripen, we have an aircraft that is currently transitioning to what is sometimes referred to as 4.5 generation specs. Saab, especially if we compare it to some of the competitors like Lockheed Martin, really doesn't use the generational breakdown, but as a shorthand it is somewhat useful to situate Gripen in the fighter jet realm. In Sweden, the Gripen C force is currently transitioning to the Gripen E, which features an improved sensor suite including a Swashblade AESA radar set, a more capable and integrated electronic warfare system, sensor fusion, 2 additional hardpoints, and a higher carrying capacity with a more powerful engine. Its cockpit has been redesigned to feature a single wide-angle display focusing on the main tactical information required for the pilot. It is an impressive aircraft for a country the size of Sweden, even if certain key components like the engine or various weapon systems come from other countries. The core strength of Gripen, however, is the ease of its maintenance and the designed ability to operate from dispersed runways. Through Gripen, the Swedish Air Force operates with the ability to quickly and effectively disperse fighter squadrons and wings from a handful of main bases to about 30 dispersal bases around the country. All Gripen needs is a straight tarmac, basically a road of 800 by 16 meters, which is surprisingly small considering it's a fighter jet, and a small ground crew of about 5 conscripts and 1 experienced crew chief. With everything that is needed for turnaround packed into a small convoy of about 1 to 2 trucks, Gripen provides a unique capability that is not mirrored in terms of specialization by any other comparable platform. That sounds impressive, and it is, but before I sound like I was sponsored here by Saab, I am not. As you know, Patreons and channel members are the ones that fund research trips, and one of them was of course recently to Saab, where I familiarized myself firsthand with Gripen and also got to chat with them on Gripen's and of course Sweden's capabilities. But let us now turn to the main question. Is Gripen dispersed operations and the Swedish Air Force model transferable to NATO. To a point, yes, there are lessons that NATO can or must learn from Sweden, but there are also, I would say, clear limitations. I will look at 4 main issues in order to integrate parts, at least, of the Swedish model into NATO air forces. Say countries, let's look at countries like Germany, Great Britain, France, or even the US, because in fact there is tightening cooperation between the US and the USAF and Sweden. So in order here to do this, we really need to think beyond the platform-centric approach that we commonly have and the assumptions that you can just make a switch happen by just buying a new platform. It doesn't work that way. So I'm going to go through this in chapters. First, I'm going to talk about Gripen itself, then I'm going to talk about basing, then training, and then the most important one, mentality. So sure, I don't want to stay platform-centric here, but this is in fact important. It's the key aspect to Gripen we must all accept. Gripen was built for dispersed operations, like no other Western fighter in service. Whether F-16, Typhoon, Rafale, you name it, none of those aircraft was designed with dispersal being a key component in the requirements. Of course, you can make an argument for some of the other planes, the old VTOL Harrier fleet, for example, or F-35B and C. But Harrier is going out of business, and F-35 is also not primarily meant for this. It'll be interesting to see, for example, how the Finns actually handle the F-35 platform, considering what they're doing is relatively similar to what Sweden does. Of course, that doesn't mean that other jets cannot disperse, but their requirements were different, so the jets themselves became different beasts, with, of course, resulting gives and takes, limiting their ease of use in dispersed operations compared to Gripen. With Gripen, you've got a small aircraft. I mean, look at it. I'm only 6'2", and it's tiny for a fighter. It is meant to land on short forest highways, be supported by a small team, and then it goes off again. All the important panels are easily accessed from the ground. You have a high-capacity auxiliary power unit for cold start requirements. You have automatic short runway landing procedures like the deflected canards. No other plane was designed like this or can be retrofitted into this. Gripen does what it is meant to do. That's its greatest strength. But also it has limitations in terms of power, range, and with some limits to the offensive weapon systems that it carries. But it perfectly fits the Swedish requirements and regional operational conditions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can transfer it to other countries. Talking about basing, it wasn't that long ago that NATO countries were still consistently conducting dispersal training as parts of their modus operandi. But since the Cold War, this was cut back, and the number of operating bases, main operating bases even, not just the dispersal ones, but those were reduced to an absolute minimum. While Western air forces, through the legacy of their operations over the past decades, can flexibly relocate parts of their force from A to B, they are heavily reliant on a very centralized system at home. Whether we are talking about 1 or 2 main repair and overhaul facilities, the heavy use of contractors, the logistic infrastructure, or the actual bases that can sustain high-intensity activity, it is a system that works within the required budgetary constraints. And that is why we in the West have the air forces that we have. We are set around a specific budgetary efficiency rather than resilience. And that moves from basing over to the training, over to the actual number of aircrafts that we have.
There's been a drive in that. This is true of all sorts of parts of the military, government, everywhere. A drive for efficiency over flexibility. So the way that the Ministry of Defence contracted out the military flying training system, as it's now called, was done on the basis of producing the right amount, no more, no less in theory, of aircrew at the right times. And if there's no flexibility or no fat in the system, if you like, then that makes it quite worrying in the military terms. Because if for example, we're involved in, for argument's sake, in a couple of years in fighting a major conflict, we can't buy, 20 more F-35s and just ordered them. We'll have them next week because we think, oh goodness, we need a few more platforms.
What this also means is that while Western air forces do have an expeditionary core or mindset, they are not set up for quick, active, decentralized, small-scale dispersal operations like Sweden. Sweden has the setup for this, from the aircraft to the small mobile dispersal teams and the actual sites where you disperse to, which other nations do not have.
The kind of core maintenance and tooling set and spares kits for a Gripen are delivered and kind of live in their main hangars on their main bases in 20-foot shipping containers that sort of plug into the side of the building, as it were, rather like trucks at a kind of supermarket distribution centre or something. You sort of reverse onto into the side of the hangar and become part of it at that point, but can then be quickly moved. And so because all the tools live in the shipping containers anyway, it's very, very quick and easy to just put those things on trucks and move them out. And then mobile teams can do the refueling, rearming, and all the protection and air traffic control and fire and rescue and everything else from vehicles in these dispersed locations for extended periods of time if they need to.
Let's then talk about training. There is something that I often run into with Gripen, and that is, well, it's really an assumption that comes with Gripen, and that is because Sweden has this reliance on conscripts. Everything is set up in such a way that you don't need a specialty or specialty training, and that is not the case. Yes, Sweden relies on conscripts for Gripen turnaround, rearmament and refueling, but it also has a highly specialized force from the C2, so command and control, global eye, and of course it sets an extremely high standards on individual pilots themselves. While NATO air forces generally look at developing a flexible, adaptive and global air force within budgetary constraints through a focus on multi-role training, enablers such as tankers and AWACS, and a mix of training experience, Sweden, because of its geographical location as a regional actor, its defense needs, and its dispersed posture that requires operators to display personal initiative, make decisions and have a substantive understanding of the tactical situation for them and others, it places a much higher emphasis on the individual pilot and small 2 to 4 ship formations rather than the system as a whole. Of course, the system itself is still important, but the reliance on it is less pronounced because that would make the dispersed operations vulnerable in the first place.
That also necessitates training their crews in a very different way from the way most European air forces or indeed global air forces train, because it implies a very high level of responsibility and mission complexity in terms of briefing as well and planning as well as flying. In particular, also potentially planning and replanning sorties at short notice in complex mission areas with limited communications and limited support crews. So even 2 ship leads or 4 ship leads have to be very, very capable. And as such, the Swedish Air Force doesn't have a tour system, for example, where in a lot of European air forces like the RAF or in the US Air Force for that matter, fast jet crews will do typically 3 years on a tour. Now they might do a couple of tours with a squadron, but typically they might move between squadrons, between bases, get experience in different roles. They may do ground tours or tours, for example, as a forward air controller or that kind of thing, and then come back to flying as a squadron commander maybe, or later as a wing commander. Whereas in the Swedish system, you join a fighter wing and you're expected to be there for 20 to 25 years. You're not expected to move, you're expected to put down roots, and essentially your career, primarily speaking, is with the squadron, or at least within the wing, which has a couple of squadrons typically. And so they have the luxury, therefore, of having this much more kind of in-depth and focused training package that goes over a decade to move up to where 2 ship leads might be 3 years in, for example, 4 ship leads maybe 6 years in if you're good. You might be trained as a 4 ship lead. Whereas compared to, say, the RAF or the US Air Force, 4 ship lead you might be expecting perhaps in your 2nd or 3rd year on squadron. And maybe even at that point, if you're very good, starting to train as a weapons instructor, which is sort of the store of tactical knowledge and combat leadership, essentially, and expertise in weapon system employment and tactics. Whereas in the Swedish system, you don't start even being looked at as a potential weapons instructor or mission commander until you've been on a wing about 10 years. So it's a much slower, more in-depth progression, and they all do air-to-air to start with, and then kind of broaden that speciality once they're combat-ready air-to-air. But it results in an extremely flexible, adaptable fighter force that can do genuinely complex, high-intensity mission sets from a really dispersed posture with this decentralized kind of tactical command and control. At the same time, it's then quite vulnerable to personnel disruption, for example. So if you lose a bunch of people who retire early, or you're struggling for retention, then of course it takes much longer to potentially make good on that loss, or that under provision of trained pilots, because it takes you so much longer to train people to the standard you need.
So okay, we come to the big elephant in the room here, mentality. The Swedish Armed Forces, we can really say, and its Air Force in particular, had developed a specific mentality around national defense, and it's very different to other countries. Finland is the closest analog. Now, Sweden's model transcends even the military. There is that concept of total defense that covers how a country as a whole is going to operate and interact with each other in times of crisis. But where that links to Gripen and the Air Force is both in training. We spoke about the levels of training of individual pilots and operators that they receive, but also in nurturing personal responsibility paired with initiative and, crucially, an appetite for calculated risks. That, if something does go wrong, and it will go wrong, serves more as a lesson rather than a reason for sanctioning or punishment. Take Sweden's main doctrine about joint operations, where it refers to this risk appetite multiple times. Here are just two examples. There are situations where operators must make decisions about risks as a result of the assignment given by a senior operator. Risks are analyzed and managed through the operation plan, and thus the risks are set against the context in which the operation will be carried out. It is in this context that we initially weigh our acceptance of risks related to the mission and its objectives. In the context of planning, we talk about the acceptable risk. An operator makes decisions about what and when something needs to be done. This means that the operator must make conscious choices about the method of decision making. For quick action, decisions must be made despite incomplete information. It assumes that opportunities are valued against risks. Big thank you here to the Swedish Air Force personnel that talked to me about this institutionalized ethos, and specifically Anton for pointing me in the direction of this open source publication. You are of course correct to say that other forces also take risks. I mean, it is indeed every single tactical, operational or strategic decision entails risks. However, there is, I would say, a difference to the degree that the Swedish Air Force manages and approaches risks as an institution. And that goes from the top echelons of officers to the single conscript. It's really not sort of this gung-ho disregard for risk. Rather, it is more about trusting in well-trained individuals to make decisions rather than subscribing them to certain procedures with the sole aim of minimizing all possible risks. This is an organizational culture that has been nurtured for many years. It's a generational thing, really. It's their smørrebrød. Yeah? They live and breathe this. NATO air forces don't. And this is one of the biggest obstacles in moving towards a Swedish model among NATO air forces.
There's a degree to which you could certainly radically improve the ability of European air forces to operate dispersed by changing procedures, permissions, practices, tactics, and particularly kind of cultural attitudes to risk. So things like watching the Swedes when I was up in the Arctic with them, doing rearming and refueling of aircraft, in some cases with the engine still running, by the side of a dispersal strip with teams of six, 5 of whom are conscripts with 2 or 3 months training, winching up and down the weapons, refueling the aircraft, certifying it all to go with one highly skilled, 3 or 4 year minimum trained technician just supervising it. The permissions and the kind of authorizations to be required to do that, and who would hold the kind of risk that a system like the German system or the British system would perceive in that. There's nothing technically stopping us doing that, but it would be a huge cultural shift to enable us to move that way.
Now I want to know from you, what do you think about this topic? What are your opinions here? Be sure to check also the description for all my sources and the many ways you can support this channel. And of course, remember, as patrons and channel members, you already have early access to a number of other videos, as well as a whole interview chain with another expert. As always, I wish all your legends a great day and see you in the sky.